Hey everybody, I got a video here for you, and this is one I've been putting together over the last week. And some people have just had some questions on Göbekli Tepe, and I know there are people that have subscribed to me that are kind of new to the ancient history thing. And I just mention sites assuming they know about them, and that's kind of a mistake I make. But questions on Göbekli Tepe, I just put together some clips that are going to go over what exactly this ancient site is all about. And John Anthony West is on the Joe Rogan Experience talking a little bit about Gobekli Tepe, and then Linda Moulton Howe is going to interview Dr. Robert Schoch. And Linda Moulton Howe is one person I used to listen to when I was into the ancient alien thing a long time ago. But I like her research, even though I don't agree with her on some of the things she says. But you should just filter out what rings true to you and what doesn't. And if somebody says something you disagree with, you shouldn't throw out everything they talk about. Ancient history isn't a court case. I just wanted to mention that. I mentioned it before. But Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson are going to be talking at the end about hunter-gatherers and the whole question on who built this site, what it actually is, and connections even to the biblical text. I mean, this comes from where they say the Garden of Eden came from. And if we go back to Google Earth, this is Göbekli Tepe, and it is right next to ancient Edessa, which is right here. Ancient Urfa, present-day Sanlurfa. This is ancient Ur of the Bible. Ancient Ur is directly connected with ancient Haran, which is just right here. But yet people think ancient Ur of the Bible is way over in Iraq somewhere. So I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions of biblical history right there. But Göbekli Tepe is right here. And now I'm just going to play some clips from some people that have done some research on this place. And this will just give you a good historical background of this place that is 12,000 years old and has really rewritten history. And here you go. Here are those interviews and talks right now.
Wow.
Well, maybe not.
So this is Göbekli Tepe,
that's
right?
The artist's study of Göbekli Tepe.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they've only uncovered less than 10% of Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah, much less. I think it's 5% or something like that. And they work, well, now it's near the Syrian border, so God knows what they're doing, but they're covering it over because once they started excavating it, been protected by the fill for all of these thousands of years, and it started deteriorating. So now unfortunately, you can no longer see it the way that Schoch and I saw it 6-7 years ago.
So what are they covering it with?
Oh, they've got sheds and roofs over it, and it's completely destroyed. It's magic, but I can't blame them if the weather is getting at it.
Well, when did they discover this?
It was actually discovered in the 90s, 94 or so, and they've been working on it ever since. And it only came into public view around 2004 or thereabouts. And here's some of the detail. And this is why Schoch is fascinated by this, because that kind of thing of the anthropomorphic, of the hands grasping around the corner, they're doing that, or something almost identical to that in Easter Island. We think Easter Island plays a role in this whole lost civilization hypothesis.
Wow.
And that's more. Again, this is raised relief. You have to chop the stone, cut or abrade the stone away from the figures. This is tough to do.
It's 3D stuff. And also, aren't there animals depicted on these things that aren't even local? They're not even available on that continent, nor do they think there's a history of these animals?
I am not sure. This one is that one there is a kind of a feline of some sort. Hard to tell exactly what it is because it's stylized.
Right.
But it's a pretty brilliant piece of sculpture, and you have to, carve away the whole stone surface in order to get at that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if they know or surmise what that is.
Yeah, it definitely looks like some sort of a
like
cat.
A puma, some sort of a puma or something. This is interesting. That's a bead that they found there from Göbekli Tepe, and this is a big mystery in a small bead. Because how did they drill that hole? It's a very, very, very hard stone.
Very hard stone, a very small stone too, because this is sitting in your hand.
That's about the size of the last digit of your thumb.
Yeah, it's tiny.
It's tiny and it's thin.
And so there's a tiny little hole in that.
Right.
And again, we're talking about a time where there was no steel.
That's right.
So how did they do that?
Exactly.
Well, aren't there's a bunch of pottery in Egypt in terms of carved stone pottery,
right.
where they have zero idea how they constructed it with a very thin lip, and then it goes inside
right.
contoured.
Yeah, I think we have one of those there. This is a bracelet found recently in Turkey, made of obsidian, which is an almost impossible stone to work with. And the ridges on it, they, again, not us, have found by doing a careful study of it geometrically that it's very sophisticated geometry at work. I forget exactly what it is that's at issue here, but it's not just a couple of cavemen saying, well, my wife is pissed off at me, so I better give her something nice for our anniversary. So I said, oh, well, here's a nice chunk of obsidian. I think I'll do a little bracelet for her. And
do they know how old this is?
Yeah, it's dated by the strata that it's found in around 8,000 BC.
Wow.
I was there with Boston University geologist Robert M. Schock, Ph.D., his wife Katie, and their Turkish tour team of Gregory Poplawski and Jack Jakubowski from Poland, and their Turkish guide, Swat. They led our group of about 40 Americans from Istanbul through many other ancient Greek, Roman, and Byzantine archaeological sites as we traveled southeastward to Göbekli during those first 2 weeks of June. Göbekli Tepe in Turkish means a pot-belly hill, first studied in a 1964 survey by Istanbul University and University of Chicago scientists, and they concluded the hill could not be entirely natural. But it was not until 1994 that German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, Ph.D., began excavating layer by layer, carefully dating and studying the surrounding soils as he dug. To his surprise, Dr. Schmidt did not find evidence of cooking hearths, no houses, no trash pits, and no clay fertility figurines. He found some stone hammers and blades, but no specific tools that could explain how the extraordinary three-dimensional sculptures were made. Eventually, Dr. Schmidt called Göbekli Tepe a 12,000-year-old cathedral on a hill without knowing who made it or why. Since 1994, only 5% of the limestone pillar circles have been uncovered. According to ground-penetrating radar, there might be at least 250 more standing pillars formed in at least 18 more circles still buried under an additional 22-some acres of deep soil. All of this built 12,000 years ago and then carefully reburied 1,000 years later. Smithsonian Magazine reporter Andrew Curry visited Göbekli Tepe and wrote, quote, "What was so important to these early people that they gathered to build and bury these stone rings? The gulf that separates us from Göbekli Tepe's builders is almost unimaginable. Indeed, though I stood among the looming megaliths eager to take in their meaning, they didn't speak to me. They were utterly foreign, placed there by people who saw the world in a way I will never comprehend," close quote. Just how certain are the scientists who have studied the Göbekli Tepe site about its age and reburial 1,000 years after the pillars were so carefully placed in circles over the 30-acre hilltop? Well, here now is my discussion about that question with Professor Robert Schock, Ph.D. geologist from Boston University.
Professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute. He's been doing absolutely meticulous studies. He's been excavating layer by layer, very carefully, very precisely, which is one reason it's been taking him so long, years and years, just to uncover the area he's uncovered so far. Something he's doing is literally peeling back the layers. And this is important from my point of view as a geologist and stratigrapher, because how a site is covered over, how the dirt is stratified, how the dirt is layered, how it's jumbled versus layered is very, very important for figuring out the history of that site. So I was very convinced that his scenario of it being purposefully covered over is absolutely the case. And as he's peeling away these layers, he's been sampling. So he samples the different layers. He samples different material in the different layers. You can sample material that the layers are composed of. So you find bits of charcoal and bone and other types of material that has carbon in it. So this is useful for carbon dating, radiometric dating, radiocarbon dating. So if you find a piece of bone, for instance, or a piece of charcoal in the material that was used to fill in the site, you can date that. That essentially dates the material that was used to fill it in. The second major point is that once it is covered over with the material, you start to form soil, you start to have natural processes taking place that, for instance, will dissolve out some of the calcite. There's a lot of limestone in this area. A lot of the debris and rubble is limestone or has calcite in it. The major pillars are made out of calcite. Calcite dissolves with rainwater. It dissolves slowly, but quite perceptibly. If anyone's looked at, for instance, a very old cathedral, they may see how it looks like the limestone looks like it's melting. So it actually dissolves, and then it reprecipitates out. You see this in caves all the time with the formation of stalactites, stalagmites. That's calcite that's dissolving from the rock and reprecipitating out. Now this happens in the case of Göbekli Tepe in the soils that form in the layer of rubble, the layer of overburden that was used to cover it over. So this starts forming after it's covered over as it forms soil, as it's rained on, and the calcite itself can be carbon dated. And by carbon dating that, we can get a fix on when it was completely covered over, because this will start forming after it's completely covered over, and it takes some time. Also, it takes at least a couple of centuries and continues to form.
I understand that Dr. Klaus Schmidt says that the refill happened approximately 8,800 BC, about 1,000 years after the pillars were first erected.
Yes, that sounds correct. Because what you do is you estimate that based on this calcite reprecipitating, these minerals forming, and they will form at a certain time, but it takes time for them to form, so the date you get on those minerals is actually later than when it was initially refilled. Mm-hmm. So we can be very confident, I believe, looking at all the data, having discussed it with him on site, that it was covered over in the 9th millennium BC, as you just said, which is an incredible amount of time from the present. We're talking 10,000 plus years ago, and we know that it was completely covered over, and then we know that it was used for 1,000 or more years before that. So this is really pushing the date of Göbekli Tepe way back geologically to the end of the last ice age, pushing it back to 12,000 years. And this is just what's exposed. This is just what's been uncovered. I actually wonder, and I'm speculating here, that as more of the site is uncovered, could some of the stone circles be even older? Could they go back even further than 12,000 years ago?
And that is at least 7,000 years older than the academically acceptable 5,000 years ago Sumerian Mesopotamian alleged beginning of civilization.
Yes, exactly. And I like the way you said it, because it's 7,000 years older than the accepted 5,000 years ago. So that's more than double. Put it this way, when the Sumerians and the early dynastic Egyptians were first doing their thing, Göbekli Tepe was already older to them than they are to us.
And I don't mean to keep harping on Michael Shermer, because I like Michael, but that he highlights this sort of natural inclination to poke fun at something that he has done no research on whatsoever. Yeah. When I pointed out Gobekli Tepe and I sent him some articles from National Geographic, he went radio silent. I mean, because
he should know about it. It's astonishing the number of people
without mocking it.
Yeah,
I mean, if you're going to mock it, you should actually know what you're mocking.
Yeah. And to say that Gobekli Tepe was created by hunter-gatherers, well, I'm sorry, that's just a theory. That's not a fact.
It doesn't seem very
you have a
reasonable
sophisticated
either.
Site with astronomical alignments, with hundreds and hundreds of megalithic pillars weighing up to 20 tons each. The world's first perfectly aligned north-south building, which you can only do with astronomy. it's not enough to say, oh, they were just hunter-gatherers. There
They
was something
moved the
extraordinary.
stones from a half a mile away.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some serious sophistication. I mean, how big were these stones?
Well, the biggest one actually is still in the quarry. They left it because it had a fault in it. They clearly intended to move it. 50 tons. You're looking at 20-foot high objects, and then it's the putting together of them. See, here's the problem. Hunter-gatherer societies are not the kinds of societies that produce large-scale fixed monuments. Why? Because they don't generate a surplus. You can't pay for somebody to become an architect and for of those times, somebody to become an astronomer. You're busy hunting and gathering, and that's what you do. Agriculture generates a surplus, and that is the problem at Göbekli Tepe, because there is no background. This site just appears out of nowhere amidst what appears to be a hunter-gatherer community, but what they're not considering is the possibility we're looking at a technology transfer, that the survivors of a lost civilization who already had all that knowledge came to Göbekli Tepe and used that site as a center of initiation to teach the local hunter-gatherers how to do agriculture. And that's now taken as the beginnings of civilization. I would say it is the reinvention or the remaking of civilization.
So when we're looking back at Sumer or any artifacts we find in ancient Mesopotamia in that area, Iraq, those are the people that are sort of reinventing and relearning.
Well, that's
Hence
the thing. Actually, when we talk of Mesopotamia, which means between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, Göbekli Tepe is sitting right there in the headwaters between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And we cannot separate that from the later cultures that enter history 5,000, 6,000 years ago. They're part of the lineage that descended from Göbekli Tepe times. And what's fascinating about Göbekli Tepe is the way it doesn't fit, the way there's no background to it, that you would expect to see them practicing, learning architectural skills. The oldest stuff should be the worst, and as they carry on, it gets better. That site ran for 1,000 years. The best stuff is the oldest. 1,000 years later, what they were producing wasn't so good. This is a real anomaly, and it needs to be investigated, not mocked by skeptics, but actually explored to consider maybe this does rock the whole paradigm.
And it's kind of ironic that in their desire to get away from the ancient myths and tales in the Bible, they've ignored those ancient myths and tales which all talk about cataclysms.
Well, part of our modern psychology is to imagine that we are somehow so far advanced from our predecessors that we now represent the pinnacle of civilization, and anything that preceded us has to be looked upon almost as, as if the workings of children. It requires a major psychological shift to admit or accept that our ancestors may have been far, far more sophisticated than we had imagined in our 19th century models, which basically still dominate thinking today.